In a land of great palaces and endless celebrations, there once lived a king who seemed to have everything a human heart could desire, yet his nights were filled not with peace but with restless thoughts. He feared the passing of his power, the fading of his youth, and the fragile nature of every joy he held close. No amount of gold or loyal subjects could silence the quiet question that echoed in his mind, will this last forever? Seeking comfort, he called upon wise men and teachers, asking for a treasure that could protect him from sorrow and keep him grounded through triumph. What they gave was not another jewel or fortress, but a small silver ring carrying a message so simple that it seemed almost ordinary. Yet its meaning reached deeper than all his riches. Etched upon its surface were 4 words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. This too shall pass. In those words the king discovered both a warning and a promise, a reminder that every storm will fade and every moment of bliss will also slip away tonight as you prepare to rest. Let this story become a gentle companion, easing the weight of your own worries and softening the tight grip of your thoughts. Allow the quiet wisdom of impermanence to guide you toward calm breathing and a tender sleep. And if you wish to keep these stories close as a comfort each night, remember to subscribe to Buddhism for Sleep, where timeless tales carry gentle lessons that cradle your heart into stillness. Part 1. The Restless Heart of a King. *The kingdom was vast and prosperous, its rivers shimmering with life, its fields stretching endlessly with golden crops, and its people living in the security of high walls and strong gates that promised safety. At the heart of it all was the palace, a marvel of stone and gold, adorned with silken banners that swayed in the warm breeze and jeweled lanterns that lit up the night. And within those walls sat the king, robed in finery, crowned with jewels, and surrounded by the sweet music of court musicians and the laughter of entertainers. To anyone looking from the outside, it would seem that no man alive could be more fortunate. He had wealth beyond counting, servants to attend to his every whim, armies that bowed to his command, and allies who came from distant lands bearing tribute and gifts. Yet when the feasts ended and the laughter of the halls gave way to silence, the king lay awake on his bed, staring into the shadows of his chamber, his heart heavy with a weight that no crown could lift. He thought often of time, of how quickly the days turned to nights and the seasons slipped away. He remembered his youth when he had been filled with boundless energy and dreams that seemed endless, and he wondered how it was that the years had passed so quickly. His reflection in the mirror reminded him that he was no longer the young prince who had once believed he could conquer eternity. His hair, once dark and thick, carried threads of silver. His face, once smooth and unlined, now bore the subtle traces of age. These changes filled him not with acceptance, but with fear. For the king believed that all he had built, all he possessed, was fragile, balanced on the edge of time's unyielding march. Every banquet he hosted, every triumph he celebrated, came with an unspoken question gnawing at his heart. How long would this last? He would look at the golden cups filled with wine and wonder when they would be empty, at the halls filled with laughter and wonder when they would fall silent, at the armies marching in perfect rhythm and wonder when they would falter. His advisors praised him, his people adored him, but deep within, he felt like a man standing on shifting sand, watching the tide creep closer with every moment. Some nights he rose from his bed and walked the palace corridors alone, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness, his mind filled with shadows of worry. He looked out from the palace balcony over the vast kingdom lit by torches and moonlight and asked himself what it all meant. Was he truly the master of this land, or merely a guardian for a fleeting moment before it slipped from his grasp? He watched his children grow, each day taller, their voices deeper, their faces carrying both the promise of the future and the reminder of his own mortality. He loved them dearly, yet their growth stirred both joy and sorrow within him. For with every step they took into their own lives, he was reminded that time was moving on, and his role was slowly shifting. The king's fear was not only for himself, but also for his people. What would become of them when he was gone? Would the kingdom endure, or would it crumble like so many others whose ruins dotted the earth? He knew the stories of kings before him, mighty rulers whose names once commanded awe, but now were barely remembered. Their palaces reduced to dust, their treasures lost, their legacies spoken of only in fading tales. He shuddered to think that he too might be forgotten, that his name might vanish like a whisper carried away by the wind. Though he had everything, peace eluded him. He longed for a certainty that nothing in the world could provide. He wanted to hold joy in his hands and make it stay, to freeze the laughter of his people so it would never fade, to keep his loved ones safe from illness and death, to preserve his youth and strength forever. Yet deep down he knew this was impossible, and the impossibility of it all gnawed at him like a hidden wound. His sleep became troubled, his dreams restless. He would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, his heart racing as if he had been running from some unseen pursuer. He would sit on the edge of his bed, the crown lying heavy on the table beside him, and press his hands to his face, whispering questions that no one could answer. His queens tried to comfort him, his advisors offered strategies, his priests performed rituals, but none of it touched the emptiness he felt. The king began to hide his worries from those around him. By day he smiled, he gave orders, he appeared confident and unshakable. But in the quiet of the night his mask fell, and he felt like a small boy again, afraid of the dark, afraid of the unknown. He thought of the day he would no longer breathe, of the silence that would follow, and the idea filled him with dread. He could not imagine himself gone, and yet he knew it was inevitable. To cope, he began collecting more wealth, believing that perhaps abundance could shield him from fear. He ordered new palaces to be built, new lands to be conquered, new celebrations to distract him. The halls filled with dancers, the tables with exotic foods, the courtyards with fireworks that painted the night sky. Yet with each display, when the lights faded and the echoes died, he felt only emptiness. The treasures piled higher, but his heart felt poorer. His people saw a king who never ceased to expand, but inside he was shrinking, becoming a prisoner of his own desires and fears. His restlessness began to spread like a shadow over the palace. Servants noticed his distant gaze, soldiers whispered about his sleepless nights, and even the children who once ran freely into his arms now approached with caution, sensing the unease that surrounded him. The kingdom was thriving, yet its ruler was withering inside. The king's longing grew more desperate. He began to call upon sages, mystics, and wanderers from distant lands. He asked them to share secrets, to teach him how to silence the fear that clung to him. Some spoke of hidden elixirs of immortality, others of powerful rituals, but none brought him the peace he craved. Their words felt shallow, their promises empty. What he sought was not more illusions, but a truth that would pierce through his restlessness, like sunlight breaking through clouds. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the king stood alone in his garden, surrounded by roses whose petals were beginning to fall with the season's change. He held one in his hand and watched it fade, its once vibrant color softening, its edges curling. He felt a pang in his chest as he realized how fragile beauty was, how quickly it slipped away. The flower reminded him of his own life, of his kingdom, of everything he loved. Nothing seemed secure. At that moment, he whispered aloud, though no one was near to hear, "What is the meaning of all this? If it must all disappear?" His words hung in the air, and the only answer was the rustling of leaves in the evening wind. That night he vowed to find a solution, something that would help him face the impermanence that haunted him. He was determined to search, not for wealth, not for power, but for wisdom. Somewhere, he believed, there must be a key to peace, a way to look at life without fear of its passing. He did not yet know where to find it, but he knew that the restlessness of his heart could no longer be ignored. It was the beginning of a journey, one that would take him far beyond the walls of his palace and deep into the truths that lie beneath the surface of all things. The king, though he did not realize it yet, was standing at the threshold of awakening, guided not by his crown or his armies, but by the quiet, persistent ache of his own heart. Part 2. The Search for Lasting Peace. The following days after the king made his silent vow were marked by a strange sense of anticipation, as though he stood at the edge of something greater than himself, but could not yet name it. He began to look differently at the world around him, noticing details that had always been present but had never touched him as deeply as they did now. He noticed how the torches in the courtyard flared brightly only to die into smoke within minutes, how the laughter of children echoed for a brief time before dissolving into silence, how the morning dew shimmered like diamonds only to vanish with the sun's rise. Everywhere he turned, he saw reminders that nothing held still, nothing endured in the way he wished it would. And this constant reminder both terrified him and urged him onward. He knew he had to seek an answer. He gathered his council and told them of his unrest, though carefully cloaked in the language of wisdom rather than fear. He announced that he wished to invite wise men, philosophers, and wanderers from across the lands to come to his court, to share their knowledge and perhaps provide insight that could calm the heart of a ruler who wanted not only to govern but to understand the essence of life itself. Messengers were sent out carrying royal invitations to distant temples, mountain retreats, and villages said to house people of great knowledge. Over time, they returned with groups of teachers, mystics, storytellers, and healers who came before the throne. One by one they spoke, offering teachings and promises. A healer told the king that with the right herbs and rare minerals he could preserve youth for decades. And the king listened politely, though deep down he knew that no potion could stop the march of time. A mystic claimed to possess a ritual that could summon spirits of protection to watch over him day and night. Yet the king knew that no spirit could change the truth of human frailty. A philosopher spoke of logic and reason, urging the king to accept that nothing was permanent and that wisdom lay in cold acceptance. But the king felt this approach lacked warmth and compassion. He wanted not just knowledge but peace, something that reached the core of his being rather than words that clattered in his mind. Days turned into weeks and the palace filled with voices and debates, but the king grew weary. Each teacher seemed to hold a fragment of truth, yet none gave him the wholeness he was searching for. At night, he still lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words of the day swirling but offering no rest. He began to wonder if he was asking for something that could not be found, if perhaps the very act of searching was the cause of his unrest. Yet something inside him, a quiet persistence, urged him not to give up. He began to leave the palace more often, traveling incognito among his people. Disguised in simple robes, he walked through markets, sat in taverns, and listened to the stories of merchants and travelers. He observed the farmers who toiled under the sun, the mothers who cradled their infants, the elders who sat quietly at the edges of the village square. He saw joy in the simplest moments: a child chasing after a butterfly, a couple sharing bread, a neighbor helping another repair a broken roof. These moments struck him more deeply than all the grand performances in his palace, for they were real, fleeting, and yet filled with meaning. One evening, while sitting beneath a tree outside a village, he struck up a conversation with an old man who was sharpening tools. The king, hiding his identity, asked him how he managed to live peacefully despite the hardships of age and poverty. The old man smiled gently and said, "Everything changes, my son. When the rains come, I am grateful. When they stop, I am patient. When I am strong, I work. When I am weak, I rest. My joy is not in holding on, but in letting life be what it is." The king was silent, struck by the simplicity of the words. They seemed so natural, so free of complication, yet he could feel their truth. It was not about controlling life, but about walking with it, allowing each moment to pass without clinging too tightly. The king returned to the palace that night, more thoughtful than ever. His search continued, but he carried with him the seed of that villager's wisdom. Perhaps peace was not something to be built with walls or bought with gold, but something to be discovered in the rhythm of life itself. The next day he summoned his advisors and asked them to search not only for learned scholars, but also for humble men and women who lived with contentment. He wanted to hear from those whose lives reflected harmony rather than just theories. More voices came to the palace, some from the humblest corners of the land. A weaver told him how she found joy in the patterns she created, knowing that each thread might break, yet still finding beauty in the whole. A gardener explained that every flower she planted bloomed only for a time before fading, and that this cycle gave her strength to face her own losses. These stories touched the king deeply, more than the grand claims of the mystics. Still, he longed for something lasting, something he could carry with him in moments of despair. One night, weary from his search, he walked through the palace garden alone. The moonlight shimmered on the fountains, and the night air carried the scent of jasmine. There, in the quiet, he whispered his plea to the universe itself. "Show me a way to live without fear of what must pass." The wind rustled the trees as if answering, and in that silence he felt both his smallness and his connection to something vast. In the days that followed, a rumor reached the palace of a man who lived in the mountains, a craftsman of humble means, yet known for wisdom beyond his station. He was neither a scholar nor a mystic, but a simple artisan who created objects that carried deep meaning. The king, intrigued, ordered that this man be brought to the court. When the artisan arrived, he bowed with humility, carrying no grand airs, only the calm presence of one who had long lived in peace. The king looked into his eyes and felt a stillness there that he had not seen in anyone else. It was as though the man's gaze reflected the same truth that the king had been chasing, though without words. The king asked him to speak, and the artisan replied gently that he could not give words that would erase the king's fear, but he could craft something that would remind him of the truth whenever his heart grew restless. The king agreed eagerly, for in his heart he sensed that this meeting was different from all the rest. The artisan requested time alone in his workshop, promising to return with a creation not of wealth but of wisdom. And so began the crafting of an object that would one day change not only the king's heart, but the lives of generations to come. A simple ring that carried the essence of all he had been searching for. Part 3. The Wise Man's Arrival. Artisan who had been summoned to the palace was unlike the other men who had walked through the gilded halls, seeking to impress the king with their elaborate words or mystical promises, for he carried no books, no sacred scrolls, and no instruments of ritual, only the quiet dignity of someone who had lived close to the earth and had learned its rhythms more deeply than most. His clothes were simple, worn from years of labor, his hands rough with the marks of craftsmanship. Yet his eyes held a depth that drew the king in, as though within them lay a still lake reflecting truths too vast to be contained in speech. When he entered the great hall filled with courtiers and advisors whispering among themselves, the air seemed to shift, for his presence was steady and unshaken by grandeur, like a stone resting unmoved by wind. The king regarded him with curiosity and a hint of hope, for he had seen many so-called wise men before, each offering cures and secrets, yet none had reached the center of his heart. He asked the man his name, and the artisan bowed and said it mattered little what he was called. For names pass as quickly as the seasons, and what endures is not the sound but the meaning carried within a life. These words, spoken so gently, struck the king with a kind of softness that none of the grand speeches of philosophers had managed. The king leaned forward and asked if the man had come with wisdom to ease a restless heart. And the artisan smiled faintly and replied that wisdom is not given like a jewel to be worn, but discovered like a seed that must grow within its own soil. The king was silent, for in those words he sensed a truth that he had long suspected but could not articulate, that no other could hand him peace, but perhaps they could guide him to discover it. He asked the artisan if he could offer such guidance, and the man nodded, explaining that he could craft for the king something simple, an object that would serve as a mirror whenever he felt lost, something to remind him not of power or permanence, but of the flow of life itself. The courtiers shifted uneasily, for they expected great displays, not simplicity, yet the king silenced them with a raised hand, for he felt drawn to trust the man. He asked what he required, and the artisan requested only a modest piece of silver and solitude in which to work. No guards, no interference, only space to shape his creation. The king agreed, and the man was given a quiet workshop near the edge of the palace grounds where the sound of hammers and voices could not disturb him. For days the artisan labored alone, his hands shaping metal with the care of one who understood not only its form but its spirit. Servants whispered of his focus, how he seemed to speak to the silver as though it were alive, how he worked by moonlight as often as by day, his presence calm, never hurried, never frustrated. Meanwhile, the king waited, each day passing with both impatience and curiosity. He tried to distract himself with affairs of state, with counsels and judgments, yet his mind always returned to the quiet figure working in the shadows of the palace. He felt as though something significant was drawing near, something unlike the empty promises he had heard before. On the seventh day, the artisan emerged from his workshop, carrying a small object wrapped in cloth. He entered the throne room where the king sat, surrounded by his advisors and courtiers. Though in that moment it felt as if only the two of them were present, the rest of the world fading away. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a simple silver ring, unadorned by jewels, its surface plain, except for an inscription etched with care. The king took the ring in his hand, surprised by its modesty. It was not the kind of treasure his court was accustomed to presenting, not glittering with gems or gold, but something humble, almost austere. Yet, as he turned it in the light, he saw the words engraved along its band. For words that seemed to pulse with quiet power. This too shall pass. At first the king stared, uncertain. He asked what such words could mean, and the artisan explained that in those 4 words lay the heart of peace. When sorrow weighs heavy upon you, remember this too shall pass, and you will endure. When joy fills your days, remember this too shall pass, and you will not cling so tightly that fear of loss steals your happiness. When anger burns or pride swells, remember this too shall pass, and your heart will soften. All things, whether bitter or sweet, rise and fall like waves upon the ocean. And knowing this frees you from the chains of both despair and desire. The hall was silent as his words sank in, and the king felt something stir within him. Not the fleeting thrill of a promise, but a steady recognition. As if he had always known this truth deep down, but had never dared to hold it so plainly. He slipped the ring onto his finger, and in that moment it felt heavier than gold, not in weight but in meaning, for it carried the essence of all he had sought. He looked at the artisan with gratitude and asked what payment he desired. But the man shook his head, saying that wisdom is not a commodity to be bought or sold. My gift is not the ring itself, but the reminder it carries. Whether you honor it or not depends on you alone. The king dismissed the court and walked into the garden alone, turning the ring over in his hand, whispering the words again and again, "This too shall pass." He looked at the blooming roses and thought of how they would wither, yet in their withering new blooms would come. He thought of his children, how their laughter would change as they grew, how one day they would leave him, yet in that change there was the continuation of life. He thought of his own fears of death, how one day his body would fall, but even that, too, was part of the great passing, no different from the dew that vanishes in the morning sun. For the first time in many years, the king felt a lightness in his chest. Not that his fears had vanished entirely, but that he could look at them without drowning. He could hold them gently, as part of the truth of life, no longer an enemy but a teacher. That night he slept more deeply than he had in years, the ring cool against his skin, the words echoing softly in his dreams like a lullaby. The following morning he rose with renewed calm, and his courtiers noticed the difference in his face, the way his eyes no longer darted with restlessness but carried a steadier light. They whispered among themselves, wondering what magic the ring held, but the king knew it was not magic at all. It was truth, plain and unembellished, but powerful enough to quiet even a king's troubled heart. In the days that followed, he carried the ring always, turning it in times of joy and in times of sorrow alike. When victories were celebrated, he smiled and whispered, "This too shall pass," and he did not cling with desperate fear. When losses came, as they inevitably did, he held the ring and remembered, "This too shall pass," and his despair softened. Slowly he began to live, not in constant fear of change, but in acceptance of its rhythm. And in that acceptance he found the beginnings of peace he had sought for so long. Part 4. The crafting of a ring. The artisan had left the palace after presenting the ring, but his presence lingered in the minds of all who had seen him, and most of all in the heart of the king. The king often wondered what kind of life could shape such wisdom, how a simple man working with his hands could hold a truth that armies and treasures could never provide. He remembered the way the artisan had spoken, not to impress, not to command, but with the calm assurance of one who had lived close to change and accepted it without resistance. The ring itself was a marvel not because of its design, for it was plain and without jewels, but because of the care and intention poured into every line of the inscription. The king asked the palace record keepers to write down the story of how it had been made, for he sensed that the act of creation was as important as the words it carried. Servants told him that the artisan had begun his work not by striking the metal, but by sitting in silence with the silver laid before him, as though asking permission from the material itself. He had whispered words as he polished the surface, words of gratitude and humility, honoring the gift of the earth that gave him this fragment of silver to work with. He had worked slowly, deliberately, never rushing, as if each movement of his hands carried the weight of his entire life's experience. When he shaped the band, he did so with a steady rhythm, heating and cooling, hammering and softening, allowing the silver to teach him how it wanted to be formed. Those who watched from a distance said that it seemed less like he was imposing his will and more like he was listening, as though he was in conversation with the metal itself. Days passed in this manner, the artisan rising with the dawn to begin his work and continuing until the moon hung high. When fatigue came, he rested without complaint. When mistakes arose, he did not curse but adjusted with patience. He was never seen to show frustration, never heard to sigh in exasperation. His work was as calm as the flow of a river, steady and persistent. The inscription, too, was not carved in haste. He spent hours tracing the letters with his finger before ever putting tool to metal, as if ensuring that the meaning would not be lost in careless lines. He believed that words carried power and that they must be etched with full awareness. For once engraved, they would last longer than the breath that spoke them. On the seventh day, he finally inscribed the words, pressing them into the silver with the focus of someone who knew he was shaping not just an object but a vessel for truth. When the ring was complete, he did not rush to deliver it, but sat quietly with it in his hands for a long time. Those who saw him said that tears glistened in his eyes, though whether they were of sorrow or joy no one could say. Some whispered that he was thinking of his own life, of the joys that had passed and the sorrows that had faded, of loved ones he had lost and days that had slipped away. The ring, for him, was not a commission for a king, but a reflection of everything he had lived. The king, when he learned of this, was moved deeply. He understood then that the power of the ring was not in its silver, but in the spirit with which it had been made. Every strike of the hammer, every pause of reflection, every whisper of gratitude had been woven into it, making it not merely a piece of jewelry, but a reminder of a way of living. The king began to reflect on how different the artisan's approach was from his own. He had lived always in haste, rushing from one ambition to the next, never pausing to listen to the rhythm of life, always trying to bend the world to his will. But the artisan had shown another way, one of listening, of patience, of allowing life to shape itself naturally. The king began to see that the crafting of the ring was itself a lesson, perhaps the truest lesson of all. He thought often of how the artisan had not decorated the ring with gems or gold, though such things were within his skill. Instead, he had chosen simplicity, as if to say that truth does not need embellishment. The king, who had surrounded himself with endless luxuries, began to wonder if he too could strip away the excess and discover something more enduring beneath. He began spending less time in the noisy feasts and more time in quiet walks, sometimes alone, sometimes with his children. He listened to their laughter with new ears, aware that each laugh was like a spark, bright and fleeting, precious because it could not be held. He looked at the faces of his people when he visited the villages, noticing the lines of age, the smiles, the tears, and realizing that their lives, like his own, were shaped by change and passing moments. Each encounter became more meaningful because he no longer expected it to last forever. The ring on his finger reminded him constantly that every joy and every sorrow was temporary, and that this truth was not something to fear, but something to embrace. In time, he began to share the story of the ring with others. When his advisors quarreled over power and territory, he held up his hand and said softly, "This too shall pass," and the room fell silent, the heat of their anger cooled by the reminder. When his people suffered a famine one season, he visited them and said the same words, reminding them that hardship was not eternal. And in his calm presence, they found strength to endure. When festivals filled the streets with joy and music, he whispered the words again, reminding himself and others not to cling. For clinging turns joy into fear of loss, while acceptance allows joy to be fully lived. The story of the ring spread through the kingdom, and people began to repeat the words to themselves in times of trouble and in times of happiness alike. It became a saying among farmers when crops failed, among mothers when their children were sick, among lovers when they parted, and even among soldiers when they marched into uncertain battles. The simple phrase carried them, just as it carried their king, because it reminded them all of a truth that was easy to forget in the rush of daily life. The king, however, never forgot the artisan who had created it. He sent for him again, not to ask for another object, but to thank him and to learn from him directly. When the artisan returned, the king received him not on the throne, but in the garden, sitting together as equals. He asked the man to speak of his life, of how he had come to live with such peace. The artisan told him stories of hardship, of years when work was scarce, of times when he had lost those he loved, of days when his body ached and his spirit faltered. But through it all, he had learned that resistance only deepened suffering, while acceptance allowed healing. He said that peace was not found in avoiding pain or clinging to joy, but in walking steadily through both, trusting that nothing remained unchanged. The king listened with humility, realizing that the wisdom he sought had been present all along, not in grand temples or rare treasures, but in the quiet lives of those who lived close to truth. He felt grateful beyond words, and though he could have showered the artisan with riches, he honored his request to remain simple, allowing him to return to his mountain home with nothing more than gratitude. From that day forward, the king carried the ring not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of humility, of impermanence, and of the simple truth that life, in all its beauty and sorrow, is always passing, always flowing, always changing. Part 5. The secret inscription revealed the silver ring had become a constant companion for the king, its presence on his finger as natural as the crown upon his head. Yet it carried a weight that was far deeper than gold or jewels could ever provide. For a time he kept the words inscribed upon it to himself, repeating them silently in moments of triumph and despair, savoring the way they softened his fears and tempered his joys. But the day soon came when the people around him began to notice a difference in the way he ruled, a change in his voice and manner that could not be ignored. His advisors, who once watched him pace the halls in restless thought, now saw him sitting quietly in the gardens, gazing at the trees with a soft smile. The soldiers who once saw him erupt in anger over the smallest disobedience now saw him pause, breathe deeply, and let go of his rage with surprising gentleness. Even his children, who once sensed his distance in the shadows of his worry, now found him more present, laughing with them, listening to their stories, and embracing them with warmth that carried no hidden fear. They began to wonder what had transformed their king, and soon whispers spread through the palace that he carried a mysterious ring, a ring that held a secret inscription. Curiosity grew until one afternoon, during a gathering of his council, the king chose to reveal it. He raised his hand, the silver band glinting in the light, and said, "You have seen the change in me, and you have asked why. It is because of these 4 simple words inscribed upon this ring." He removed it from his finger and held it up for them to see, letting the sunlight catch the engraving. The courtiers leaned forward, their eyes straining to read the inscription, and when they saw it, they murmured in confusion. "This too shall pass," they repeated among themselves, puzzled by the simplicity of the phrase. One advisor stepped forward and asked how such common words could carry so much power. The king smiled and replied that when you understand them not only with your mind but with your heart, they become the key to peace. When sorrow comes, you do not drown in it, for you know it will fade. When joy arrives, you do not grasp at it with desperation, for you know it too will fade, and so you enjoy it fully without fear. When anger rises, you remind yourself that it will pass, and your temper cools. When fear clutches your chest, you whisper these words, and the grip loosens. These words remind us of the nature of life itself, that nothing remains unchanged, and in this truth lies our freedom. The advisors sat in silence, some skeptical, others contemplative, but the king continued, saying that for years he had sought peace in riches, in power, in wisdom from distant lands. Yet it was not until he held these words close that he found it. The power of the ring is not in the silver, but in the reminder it carries, a reminder so simple that even a child can understand, yet so profound that even a king can be transformed. The news of the inscription spread beyond the palace walls, carried by servants and messengers, until soon the phrase was spoken in the streets and markets. Farmers repeated it to one another when drought threatened their crops, believing that the rains too would return. Mothers whispered it to their children when they cried, soothing them with the promise that their pain would not last. Merchants said it during long journeys when storms struck, trusting that clear skies would follow. It became a phrase on the lips of the people, woven into their lives with the same quiet strength it had given their king. Yet as the word spread, so too did misunderstandings. Some took them as an excuse for indifference, shrugging off responsibilities with the belief that problems would simply pass without effort. Others dismissed them as too simple to hold any real wisdom, thinking that only grand philosophies and rituals could bring truth. The king, hearing of this, realized that it was not enough to simply reveal the words. He needed to show his people how to live them, and so he began to embody the inscription not only in private moments, but in the way he governed. When a neighboring kingdom threatened war, his advisors urged him to prepare for bloodshed, but the king replied calmly, "This too shall pass." And instead of rushing into battle, he sought dialogue. His patience led to peace, for the enemy king, too, was weary of endless fighting. When famine struck his land, instead of collapsing into despair, he reminded his people that hardship was not eternal. He organized relief with a steady hand, assuring them that the season would change. His calm gave them courage to endure until the rains returned. When festivals filled the streets and his people rejoiced, he joined them with laughter but reminded them gently that the celebration would end, and that they must carry joy not as a clinging memory but as a living gratitude. Slowly, his kingdom began to reflect the balance he carried within. His people learned that the words were not an excuse for passivity, but an invitation to live fully, to face sorrow with resilience and joy with humility. The ring became a symbol of wisdom, not because it was magical, but because it reminded them of what was always true. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the king walked among his people without guards, wearing simple robes, They greeted him not with fear, but with affection. For he was no longer a distant ruler hidden behind walls, but a man who walked with them, sharing their joys and sorrows. A child ran up to him and asked if the ring really held magic. The king knelt and placed the ring in the child's hand, saying, "Its magic is not in the metal, but in your heart. Whenever you are sad, remember that it will pass. Whenever you are happy, remember that it too will pass. That is the magic, and it belongs to you as much as it belongs to me." The child smiled and repeated the words, and the king saw in that moment how the wisdom would carry on through generations. Not because of him, but because the truth was universal. As the years went by, the ring became more worn, the silver dulled by time, but the words remained sharp and clear, etched not only into the band, but into the lives of all who spoke them. The king grew older, his hair grayer, his steps slower, yet he no longer feared the passing of time. He wore his age with grace, understanding that youth had passed as it was meant to, and that old age too would pass in its time. When he looked at his children grown into leaders of their own, he felt no sorrow at the change, but gratitude for the continuity of life. When he looked at his kingdom, thriving and peaceful, he knew that one day even his reign would pass, and he was at peace with it. The secret inscription was no longer secret, for it had become part of the very breath of his people, a phrase that shaped their resilience and their joy. And the king, once restless and afraid, now carried a serenity that was unshaken by storms or triumphs. A serenity born not of denial, but of deep acceptance. He knew that all things, whether grand or small, whether joyous or painful, moved in the same rhythm, rising and falling, appearing and fading. He knew, finally, that nothing was to be clung to and nothing to be feared, for all was part of the great flow of life. And each time he turned the ring on his finger, he whispered once more, "This too shall pass." And in those words he found the eternal peace that no throne, no crown, no treasure could ever give. Part 6. Joys that fade, sorrows that softening the years that followed the revealing of the ring's inscription. The king began to experience life in a way he never had before, and though he still wore the crown and carried the burdens of leadership, he no longer moved through his days with the same heaviness that had once haunted him, for he had learned to look upon the events of his life with the eyes of impermanence, and that awareness softened everything he touched, and everything that touched him. When joy came, it was brighter than ever before, for he no longer tried to clutch it with desperate hands. Instead, he let it bloom, like a flower open and radiant, knowing that it would fade as all flowers do, and because he accepted its passing, he savored it more deeply. When festivals filled the streets and music echoed through the palace halls, he laughed not with the fear that the celebration might end, but with the fullness of someone present in that moment entirely. When his children embraced him, when they told him stories, when they played at his feet, he let their joy soak into his heart without worrying how long it would last. He saw that trying to hold joy forever was the very thing that made it slip through his grasp. But when he let it come and go freely, it left behind a gentle fragrance that lingered in his memory. Without sorrow, joy lived longer when it was not chained on the other side. When sorrow visited, as it inevitably did, he discovered a new way to meet it. For in the past he had resisted grief as though it were an enemy, but now he greeted it as a passing guest. When a friend from his youth fell ill and passed away, he felt the ache of loss, but he whispered to himself, "This too shall pass," and in that whisper he found space to grieve without drowning. The sorrow softened not because it disappeared instantly, but because he no longer wrestled with it. He let it move through him like rain over the earth, nourishing something hidden within. When Famine touched part of his land again, and his people suffered. He did not sink into despair. As before, he worked with clear resolve to bring aid, but he carried within him the steady truth that even this hardship would pass, and because he held that perspective, his people too felt steadier. They saw in their king's calmness a mirror of their own potential strength. They endured not because their pain was lessened, but because they knew it was temporary. The king noticed this pattern again and again in the small and large events of life. When anger rose within him, he remembered that it too would pass, and his hand that might have struck in wrath instead remained open. When fear whispered in the night, he remembered it too would pass. And he found himself able to rest. When pride swelled after victories, he remembered it too would pass, and humility returned to ground him. The words of the ring did not erase life's experiences, but they transformed the way he walked through them. Each joy became sweeter, each sorrow became softer, each victory became lighter, each failure less crushing. The kingdom too began to change, for the people had taken the words into their own hearts. Mothers taught their children to whisper them when they cried. Fathers reminded one another of them when work grew heavy. Neighbors spoke them in times of conflict. Until tempers cooled, the words became woven into the songs sung in the fields and into the prayers spoken at night. They became a common language of resilience and acceptance. One season, when floods swept across villages, destroying homes, the people remembered the king's teaching. They mourned their losses, yet they worked together to rebuild, knowing the waters would recede and the land would heal. They drew strength from the promise that hardship would not last forever, and in the seasons that followed, when harvests were abundant, they celebrated with joy, but not with arrogance. They remembered that abundance too would pass, so they shared more freely with those in need, living the balance. The king himself had learned to embody the ring, continued to remind him in countless subtle ways. Sometimes when he sat alone at night and turned it slowly on his finger, he would reflect on his own life, how much had already passed, how much would still pass. He thought of his childhood games in the palace, gardens gone now like smoke. Though the memory lingered, he thought of his coronation, the thunder of drums, the roar of voices so vivid once, yet now softened by years. He thought of the countless meals eaten, conversations had journeys taken, and he realized how all had flowed through him like water through his hands. Yet he did not despair, for he understood now that life's beauty lay not in its permanence, but in its movement. The passing itself was what made each moment precious. When he held his grandchildren in his arms, years later, their small hands gripping his fingers, he smiled with quiet gratitude, knowing that one day they would grow and change, and eventually even leave this world. But instead of sorrow, he felt wonder at being part of that endless chain of passing moments of lives, flowing into lives of generations, giving way to generations. The courtiers, who once thought the phrase too simple, began to see its depth. They watched the king rule with steadiness through storms, and with humility through triumphs, and they could not deny the transformation. They too began to whisper the words in their private struggles, and found comfort. The soldiers in the field, who once trembled at the thought of death, whispered the words before battle, and found courage, for they knew that fear itself would pass, that even war would pass, that nothing was eternal, and in that truth they stood stronger. The merchants, traveling dangerous roads, repeated the words when storms threatened their caravans, and when profits tempted their greed, and they found balance. The entire kingdom was slowly reshaped, not by new laws or grand monuments, but by 4 simple words etched into a silver ring and lived out in the heart of a king. As the years passed, the king grew older, and the truth of impermanence revealed itself in his own body. His hair turned white, his steps slowed, his voice grew softer, yet he welcomed these changes with grace, for he knew that youth had passed, and that age too would pass. He no longer feared the shadow of death. He saw it as part of the same rhythm that guided everything else. He even began to speak of it openly to his people, telling them not to fear his eventual passing, for kings too are subject to the same law. This too shall pass, he said, smiling one evening to his gathered family. When my time comes, do not cling in sorrow, but live fully, knowing that my life, like yours, was a gift of moments, rising and fading. The people listened with tears in their eyes, yet their hearts were strengthened, for they knew their king had found peace, and in his peace they too found courage. The ring remained on his finger through all these years, worn smooth by time, but its words still sharp as ever. Whenever he looked at it, he remembered the artisan who had given it to him, not as a treasure, but as a mirror that reflected the truth of all existence. Sometimes the king wondered if he would have ever discovered this truth without that gift. Perhaps life itself would have eventually shown him, but he felt deep gratitude that the words had reached him when they did, sparing him years of needless fear and restlessness. He carried this gratitude quietly, always mindful of the simple man whose wisdom had touched a kingdom, and when he looked upon his people thriving with resilience, he knew the legacy of those 4 words was greater than any monument he could have built. For monuments crumble and names fade, but truth endures, not in stone but in hearts. And so the king continued to live each day with the rhythm of impermanence, accepting joys as gifts, sorrows as teachers, and life itself as a flowing river, never still, always moving, always changing, always passing. And in that acceptance he found the peace he had sought for so long, the peace that came not from resisting life, but from embracing it fully, knowing with every breath, this too shall pass. Part 7. The King's Awakening. The years moved steadily across the king's life, like the quiet but unstoppable flow of a river, and though the silver ring on his hand had become worn smooth with age, its inscription remained as sharp in his heart as the day he had first received it. And in that steady reminder, the king found something deeper than comfort. He found awakening. It began subtly, as most truths do, not with a blinding revelation or a sudden miracle, but with small changes in the way he saw the world around him. He began to notice that when he woke in the morning, the rising sun felt like a blessing, not because it promised endless days, but because it offered one more day to live and breathe and love. When he ate, he tasted each bite, slowly remembering that the meal would soon end, and that made it more precious. When he looked upon his children, now grown and carrying responsibilities of their own, he felt pride, not weighed down by fear of losing them, but lightened by gratitude that he had walked beside them for as long as he had. The awakening was not about escaping sorrow or clinging to joy, but about seeing clearly that both were part of the same fabric of existence, woven together by the passing of time. Once he would have raged against aging, once he would have tightened his grasp around wealth and power, once he would have feared death like an enemy lurking in the shadows. But now he saw that all of these were simply movements in the same dance. Every wrinkle on his face was a record of laughter and tears, every white strand of hair a mark of time's gentle hand, and every ache in his bones a reminder that his body too was part of nature's cycle. Nothing in him was separate from the passing seasons. The king's awakening deepened when he began spending more time among his people, not as a ruler issuing decrees from a throne, but as a man walking among men. He visited villages without ceremony, sat among farmers and listened to their stories, ate with them from simple bowls, and laughed at their children's games. He saw in their lives the same truths that had shaped his own, that joys faded but left tenderness behind, that sorrows softened when shared, that nothing lasted, yet everything mattered because it had been lived. The people noticed the change in their king. They saw that he no longer clung to appearances of grandeur. His crown became lighter, his throne less important, his robes simpler, his presence more approachable. He ruled still with firmness when needed, but it was a firmness balanced by compassion. A firmness that grew not from pride but from clarity, and his people loved him more for it. They no longer saw him only as a distant monarch, but as a wise elder, who walked the same path of impermanence as they did, and they trusted him with a depth that could not be commanded. Only earned. The awakening also transformed the way the king responded to conflict. Once he might have met threats with swift anger, but now he met them with patience and understanding. When neighboring rulers sought to provoke him, he reminded himself and his advisors that anger and pride too shall pass. He chose diplomacy more often than war, and when war was unavoidable, he led with compassion even toward his enemies, for he knew that hatred bound people as tightly as chains, while forgiveness set them free. His court was astonished when he pardoned a captured enemy ruler, saying, "This too shall pass, let us not add more." Suffering to the world and his mercy sowed seeds of peace that endured far longer than any victory. Through bloodshed within his own palace, disputes arose, as always do among those close to power, but the king no longer fed them with suspicion or paranoia. Instead, he listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, his words were measured with the rhythm of impermanence, reminding all who served him that titles, power, and influence were fleeting, and that only integrity and kindness left a true mark. Many who once schemed for advantage began to soften in his presence, realizing that their efforts to cling would ultimately crumble in time. The ring had not only changed a king, it had begun to change a kingdom. But perhaps the most profound awakening came within the king himself. Late at night, when he sat alone in his chamber with only the moonlight for company, he would turn the ring slowly between his fingers and feel its coolness against his skin. He would whisper the words, "This too shall pass," and let them sink into his heart, deeper than thought, deeper than emotion, until they became not just words, but the lens through which he saw all existence. In those moments, he felt a peace so profound that even his fear of death seemed to dissolve. He realized that death was not an end to be feared, but a continuation of the same truth that guided everything else. Just as day passed into night and winter passed into spring, his life too would pass into another form, unknown but natural, and because he accepted this, he no longer lived in dread, but in quiet readiness. He began to teach this awakening to his children, telling them stories, not of glory and conquest, but of humility and impermanence. He told them to rule, not by grasping, but by letting go, not by clinging to power, but by serving with compassion, not by fearing loss, but by embracing change. His children listened, and though they were young and ambitious as he once was, they carried the seeds of his wisdom, which he trusted would one day grow in them, as they had grown in him. The awakening also reached the king in the most ordinary of moments. One morning, while walking through the palace garden, he paused to watch a butterfly settle on a flower, its wings trembling in the breeze, and he thought of how brief its life must be, yet how radiant it was in that moment, and he realized that the beauty of the butterfly was not diminished by its brevity, but enhanced by it. It was precisely because it would not last that it shone so brightly. He smiled and whispered again, "This too shall pass," not in sadness, but in reverence for the fleeting miracle before him. As the seasons turned and the king grew older, the people often remarked how serene he had become. Even in times of crisis, his voice remained steady, his gaze clear, his presence calming. It was not that he had become detached from life. He still laughed, still cried, still loved deeply, but he no longer clung or resisted. He allowed each experience to flow through him, leaving him lighter, freer, and in that freedom he discovered the essence of awakening, that life itself was not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be lived fully in every passing moment. One evening, during a Gathering in the palace courtyard, the people pressed him to speak of the ring once more. They asked him to tell them why such simple words carried such great power, and the king stood before them, holding up his hand so they could see the worn band. Upon his finger he told them that the ring had not changed the world, but it had changed him. It had taught him to see clearly that joy and sorrow rise and fall like waves on the sea, that nothing can be held forever, and that this truth, once feared, is in fact the doorway to peace. He said, when you embrace impermanence, you stop fighting against life and start flowing with it. You stop fearing the end of joy and start cherishing it more deeply. You stop resisting sorrow and allow it to soften. And in that balance, you find freedom. The people listened in silence, many with tears in their eyes, for they too had begun to feel the truth of his words in their own lives, and they understood that their king was not offering them a doctrine or a command, but a way of seeing, a way of living that brought calm to the restless heart as he looked upon their faces lit by the lanterns of the evening. The king realized that his awakening was not his alone. It belonged to all of them, to anyone willing to see that impermanence was not an enemy but a teacher, and in that realization his heart swelled with gratitude. He knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all those years, not in the treasures of the palace, not in the victories of war, not in the praises of courtiers, but in the quiet truth etched upon a simple ring for words that had carried him from fear into peace. This too shall pass. Part 8. The Kingdom Transformed. The awakening of the king did not remain within the boundaries of his own heart for long, for the nature of truth is that when it is lived, it cannot be contained. It spreads quietly like the fragrance of a flower carried on the wind, and so it was with the silver ring and the words it carried. As the king lived more peacefully, more gently, and more wisely, his people began to mirror his way of being, and slowly the entire kingdom was transformed. Once the court had been a place of tension, filled with whispers of ambition and schemes of rivalry, but now the courtiers found themselves softened by the king's example. When disagreements arose, they found it harder to cling to pride, for they remembered the king's steady reminder that this too shall pass. They began to listen more carefully to one another, knowing that anger and resentment lose their power when seen through the lens of impermanence. The court grew quieter, yet more sincere. Decisions, once driven by fear or greed, were now shaped by clarity and balance. The soldiers felt the change once they had fought with the desperation of men terrified of loss, clinging to victory as if it were the only measure of their worth. But now they carried the words of the ring in their hearts. They remembered them in battle and found courage not from the illusion of immortality, but from the conceptance of life's fragility. They fought not with hatred, but with discipline, and when peace was possible, they embraced it gladly, for they knew that even enmity would pass. Merchants traveling the roads of the kingdom adopted the phrase as a mantra, repeating it during storms. When wagons broke or goods were lost, it gave them patience to endure and perspective to rebuild. When profits were high, they remembered it too would pass, and so they shared more freely rather than hoard their wealth. The farmers in the fields spoke it to one another when rains delayed or when crops failed, and it gave them strength to wait for the season to change. They found gratitude in abundance, without arrogance, and courage in scarcity. Without despair, families in villages taught their children to whisper the words when they felt afraid at night, or when they cried from small hurts, and the children grew up learning that fear too would pass, that pain too would soften, and that joy was not to be clutched but cherished in its fleeting glow. The words became part of songs sung at harvest festivals and lullabies whispered in cradles. The kingdom itself began to carry the rhythm of impermanence in every aspect of life. There was less clinging, less grasping, less fear of change. People began to live more fully in the present moment, knowing that It would pass, and because they knew it would pass, they honored it more deeply. The festivals that once were consumed with indulgence became celebrations of gratitude. Each bite of food savored, each dance enjoyed, without the desperation of clinging to its continuation. Mourning to changed. When loved ones died, grief still came, but it was met with the gentle reminder that sorrow itself would pass, and so the people allowed themselves to feel deeply without being crushed. Their grief softened like waves receding on the shore. Their resilience grew, their love deepened, and their community bonds strengthened. The kingdom, once driven by ambition and fear, was now marked by compassion and balanced. Trade flourished, not only because of goods, but because trust grew among neighbors. Alliances with other lands deepened, not only because of treaties, but because the king's wisdom inspired respect from rulers near and far. He became known not as the conqueror or the wealthy, but as the wise, and his reputation brought pilgrims and seekers from distant lands who wished to hear the story of the ring and learn from his way of life. The palace no longer gleamed only with jewels, but with gatherings of storytellers, philosophers, travelers, and simple folk who came to share their experiences of impermanence. The halls, once filled with noise of restless ambition, now carried the hum of sincere conversation and laughter. Rooted in presence, the artisans of the land found inspiration in the phrase, weaving it into tapestries, carving it into wood, singing it into music. Their art became a reflection of the truth that beauty is fleeting and therefore precious, and their creations were cherished not for their permanence, but for the feelings they evoked in their moment of being. The king himself continued to walk among his people more than ever, not as a distant ruler, but as a companion on the path of life. He joined them in their joys and sorrows, repeating the words with them. When storms came and when celebrations overflowed, he listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with simplicity. He did not command them to live by the words, he showed them how to live them, and his presence became the greatest teaching of all. As the kingdom transformed, so too did the king's family. His children, who once struggled with the ambitions of youth, began to embrace the wisdom their father embodied. They saw in his calmness a model for their own lives. They learned to govern not with fear of losing power, but with compassion for those they served. They learned to love without clinging to control, and to accept change as part of growth. When disputes arose among them, as siblings, they recalled their father's steady teaching and allowed their quarrels to soften. They grew not only into leaders, but into human beings, shaped by humility and clarity, and the king watched them with gratitude, for he knew that the truth would outlive him, not only in words, but in the way his children would carry it forward. Time itself seemed to honor the kingdom as it lived in harmony. Seasons of hardship still came, as they always do, but they no longer shattered the people. Seasons of joy still came, as they always do, but they no longer intoxicated the people. Both joy and sorrow were met with steadiness, and because of this the kingdom endured with a strength greater than armies or walls. It endured with the strength of hearts aligned with truth. The neighboring lands noticed this transformation. To some, scoffed at its simplicity, believing that no kingdom could be guided by a phrase so small, but those who came closer saw the depth of it. They saw how the people lived with resilience, how the king ruled with compassion, how the children laughed with freedom, and how the elders spoke with peace. And slowly they too began to whisper the words in their own languages. This too shall pass became not only the wisdom of one king or one kingdom, but a teaching carried across borders like the wind itself. Yet within the heart of the king it remained personal, for though his kingdom thrived, his greatest joy was the quiet awakening that continued to unfold within him. He no longer measured his worth by the size of his army or the weight of his treasure, but by the clarity of his heart and the gentleness of his presence. He saw his own aging not as a tragedy, but as a continuation of the same truth that guided the trees to shed their leaves and the rivers to flow endlessly. He felt at home in the rhythm of life. He felt free in a way he had never known before. His kingdom had been transformed, but so had he, and as he walked through the streets, seeing his people live with more kindness, more patience and more courage, he felt gratitude so deep it needed no words. He understood at last that peace was not something he had achieved, but something he had allowed. Something that had been waiting for him all along, revealed through the passing of all things and etched forever on a simple silver ring. Part 9. Lessons, whispered through generations. As the seasons turned and the king grew older, his story and the story of the silver ring began to flow beyond the borders of his reign, like a river that begins in the mountains and eventually finds its way into the vastness of the sea. What had once been a private comfort to a restless monarch became a living teaching carried in the words and actions of his people. It was whispered in homes, sung in fields, spoken in markets, and remembered in the silent prayers of the sick and the weary. The phrase, "This too shall pass," became more than a reminder, became a thread woven into the culture of the kingdom, and through it the wisdom of impermanence was passed from one generation to the next. Grandparents spoke it to children when they cried over small hurts. Children repeated it to one another when they stumbled in play. Parents taught it as a shield against despair when crops failed or illness struck. It gave strength in times of hardship and humility in times of abundance. It was a wisdom that did not belong to the king alone, nor even to his kingdom, but to anyone willing to see that change is the only constant, and that freedom lies not in clinging, but in letting go. The king himself often walked among his people, listening to their stories, and he began to see the depth of how the words had taken root in their lives. One farmer told him that when drought threatened his fields, he remembered the phrase, and instead of collapsing into hopelessness, he waited with patience, and when the rains came, he wept not only for relief, but for gratitude. Another told him that when his wife passed away, he whispered the words through his tears, and though grief did not vanish, it softened enough to allow him to carry on caring for their children. A mother told him that when her child was sick, she repeated the words to herself and to her little one, and they gave her the strength to endure the sleepless nights and the faith to welcome the dawn with hope. The king realized then that the wisdom he had once thought of as his personal salvation had become a gift far greater than he imagined, for it had grown into a living inheritance carried in the hearts of his people and passed down like a treasured song. What touched him most was seeing how the phrase was not only spoken in sorrow but in joy. Children laughed and said it to each other when they shared sweets, knowing the taste would not last but that another treat would come. Lovers whispered it when they embraced, aware that each moment of love was fleeting, and therefore all the more precious. Elders spoke it at festivals, reminding the young to savor the joy of dance and music, for the night would fade but memory would remain. The balance of impermanence gave both gravity and lightness to their days. Sorrow no longer crushed, joy no longer intoxicated. Life was lived with a rhythm that honored the passing of all things. The king also began to teach more openly in his later years, not as a preacher but as a storyteller. He would gather children in the gardens and tell them of his own restlessness, his search, his meeting with the artisan, and the simple ring that changed everything. He showed them his hand worn with age, the ring still shining though dulled by years, and he would say, "These words will live longer than me, longer than you, longer than stone or gold. They are not mine, they are for all who breathe." And when he spoke, the children listened, not because he was their king, but because his words carried the weight of lived truth. His sons and daughters, to absorb the lesson, they watched their father's serenity as his body aged, and they saw how he faced illness, pain, and weakness without bitterness, but with acceptance and dignity. They realized that true strength was not in denying change, but in embracing it. And they carried this understanding into their own lives as they began to rule in his stead. They did not cling to the crown, but wore it as a responsibility. They did not fight against change, but guided their people through it. They did not seek glory, but balanced the lessons of impermanence whispered through their governance, just as it had through their father's heart as time passed and the king's hair grew white. His people began to prepare themselves for the day they knew would come, the day their wise ruler would pass from this world. But because they had lived so long with his teaching, they did not dread it as they might once have, for they knew that even the life of a king, this too shall pass. When at last his health began to fade, the kingdom grew quieter, not with despair, but with reverence. The people gathered in temples and in their homes, repeating the words he had given them like a prayer for his comfort and their own. The king lay in his chamber, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, and though his body was frail, his eyes were clear and peaceful. He held the ring gently in his hand and whispered to them that nothing he had given them in wealth or land was greater than the lesson inscribed upon this band. He told them to live, not by clinging to what they feared to lose, but by cherishing it while it lasted, to love without chains, to lead without pride, to endure without despair, and to remember always that whatever arises will one day fade. As he spoke these words, his family wept, yet their tears were softened by the calmness in his voice, for he was not afraid, he was ready. And when the moment came when his final breath passed, it was met with silence, not of shock, but of deep reverence. His people mourned, but their mourning carried the wisdom he had lived. They grieved, but they remembered it too would pass. And so they honored his life, not with endless sorrow, but with gratitude. The generations that followed continued to tell his story, the story of the restless king, the wise artisan, and the simple ring. The story became legend, and the legend became a teaching carried far beyond the borders of his land. Travelers spoke it in distant markets, wandering monks carried it to other kingdoms, parents told it to their children at night, and in each retelling the truth lived on, unchanged like the inscription etched into silver. The story of the ring became not about a single king or a single land, but about the truth of all life, the truth that joy fades, sorrow softens, victories pass, defeats pass, beauty passes, youth passes, even grief itself passes. But in that passing is not loss, but the gift of presence. To live awake to the fleeting moment is to live free. And so, through whispers and stories, through lullabies and laments, through celebrations and farewells, the lesson moved through generations like an eternal breath, never ending, always passing, always returning. And the kingdom, though changed through time, carried forward a legacy, not of wealth or conquest, but of wisdom etched, not only in silver, but in the hearts of all who remembered that this too shall pass. Part 10. The Eternal Truth of Impermanence. The story of the king and his silver ring did not end with his passing, for truth is not bound to the life of one man. It is carried forward in the lives of those who embrace it and in the hearts of those who whisper it. And so the lesson of impermanence that had once eased the restlessness of a single ruler became a light that continued to shine long after his crown was laid aside. The people of his kingdom remembered him not with the fear of loss, but with gratitude for the wisdom he had lived. They spoke of him as the king who had learned to smile at both joy and sorrow, who had led with clarity and compassion, who had taught them by his own example to see the world not as something to control, but as something to cherish. They did not build towering monuments in his name, nor carve his image into stone, for they knew that even stone crumbles and monuments fall instead. They carried his teaching into their lives and their choices, into the way they raised their children and the way they met their deaths. The kingdom itself flourished in the centuries that followed, not because it was free of hardship, for hardship came, as it always does, in the form of drought and war and disease, but because the people had learned how to face hardship without breaking. They repeated the words, "This too shall pass," when the storms raged and when famine threatened, and in remembering, they found the strength to endure, and when joy returned, in the form of abundant harvests, peaceful years, and festivals filled with laughter, they repeated the words again, "This too shall pass," and so they savored their joy without fear of its ending. The balance, shaped by those 4 words, allowed the kingdom to remain steady through the rise and fall of generations. Even when new rulers came, even when borders shifted, even when time erased the names of those who once held power, the truth remained, for truth is not subject to time. It is discovered again and again by those willing to see the way the world truly is. The legend of the king and the ring spread far beyond his land, carried by merchants, monks, travelers, and storytellers across mountains, deserts, and seas. Wherever it was told, it took root in the hearts of listeners who recognized themselves in the tale. Some saw in the king's restlessness a reflection of their own fears of change and death, and they found comfort in the lesson. Others saw in his awakening a path they longed to walk themselves, and they began to whisper the words in their own languages. Across centuries, the phrase became part of many traditions, sometimes spoken in temples, sometimes in households, sometimes in the silence of a single heart facing loss. It crossed cultures and times, always carrying the same quiet power, reminding those who heard it that nothing is forever, and that in this truth lies both the humility and the strength to live fully, though the silver ring itself may have been lost to history. Its essence endured, for its value was never in the metal, but in the message etched upon it, and that message, once whispered to calm the fears of a king, continued to ripple outward, like circles in a pond, reaching further and further. With no end, the eternal truth of impermanence became not a doctrine to be debated, but a lived reality. Anyone could see in the changing of seasons, in the fading of flowers, in the aging of faces, in the rise and fall of empires. It was not hidden. It was everywhere, and yet it needed to be remembered again and again, for the human heart so easily forgets, so easily clings, so easily fears the passing of what it loves, or resists the coming of what it dreads. The lesson of the ring was not to deny these feelings, but to hold them gently, to see them as waves that rise and fall upon the ocean of life. The story endured because it was simple and because it was true, and in its simplicity lay its power. For while philosophies shift and kingdoms crumble, the truth that all things pass remains unchanged, and it is this truth that sets the heart free. Those who heard the story often found themselves living differently, not by withdrawing from life, but by entering it more fully. A farmer who remembered the phrase worked his fields with patience, knowing that seasons of struggle would give way to seasons of abundance. A mother who remembered it comforted her child with both tenderness and strength, knowing that pain was temporary, and so was fear. A ruler in another land who heard the story chose mercy instead of vengeance, because he knew that anger too would pass, and that love endured longer than hate in each life. Touched by the story, the words became more than a memory. They became a practice, a way of breathing and living and letting go. The eternal truth of impermanence was not meant to lead people into despair, but into freedom. For when you know that everything changes, you stop clinging to what cannot be held, and in releasing your grip, you discover that you can finally experience life fully. You can laugh without fearing the end of laughter. You can grieve without fearing you will be trapped in grief forever. You can love without chaining the beloved you can live without fearing death. This was the gift the king had received from a humble artisan, and this was the gift he left behind for countless generations, a gift that outlasted palaces, crowns, and even memory itself, for though his name faded, as all names do, the truth he embraced remained eternal. As long as there are hearts that suffer from fear of change, as long as there are souls that long for peace, the story of the king and the ring will live on, reminding them that joy fades sorrow, softens victories end, defeats pass, beauty ages, strength wanes. Youth gives way to old age, but nothing is truly lost, for in each passing there is also renewal, and in each ending there is also beginning. To understand this is to awaken, and to awaken is to live free. The eternal truth of impermanence asks nothing more than presence, to be here fully in this moment, knowing it is fleeting, to embrace it, not with desperate clinging, but with gentle gratitude, to walk through life, not as a prisoner of fear, but as a traveler who knows that every step, every sunrise, every breath is precious because it will pass, and because it will pass, it is infinite in its value. This is the truth that guided a restless king into peace. This is the truth that transformed a kingdom into a place of balance. This is the truth that has carried itself through centuries, whispering in countless tongues and hearts. And this is the truth that will endure long after all else has faded, the truth that this too shall pass. The story of the king and the silver ring is more than a tale from the past. It is a timeless mirror reflecting a truth that each of us carries within our own lives. Whether we sit on thrones or in humble homes, whether we are young and restless or old and weary, the rhythm of life touches us all. Joys come and fade, sorrows rise and soften, victories appear and dissolve, and nothing ever stays the same. When the king first received the ring, he thought it was a treasure, but in time he learned that the treasure was not in the silver, but in the words etched upon it, "This too shall pass." Those words became a light, guiding him out of restlessness and fear into peace and wisdom. And that same light can guide us too when we learn to see impermanence not as something to fear, but as something to accept. We begin to live differently. We begin to taste joy without clinging to it. We begin to face sorrow without being crushed. We begin to meet change, not as an enemy, but as a teacher. We discover that peace is not found in holding on, but in letting go. The lesson of impermanence frees the heart from the endless cycle of desire and resistance. And in that freedom, we find a calmness deeper than any crown or treasure could ever bring. Just as the king learned to walk through life with serenity, we too can carry this wisdom in our own days. When we wake in the morning, we can remember that each day is fleeting and therefore precious. When we feel overwhelmed by sadness, we can whisper to ourselves that it too will pass. When we feel joy, we can smile more deeply, knowing it too will pass, and that is what makes it beautiful. Life lived with this awareness becomes richer and gentler, each moment honored for what it is, not feared for what it might become. As you rest now, letting your eyes grow heavy and your breath soften, carry these words with you. Let them cradle you as you drift into sleep. This too shall pass. The worries of the day, the noise of the mind, the weight of the body, all of it will pass, and in that passing there is space for peace. If this story has touched your heart, if it has given you comfort in the gentle hours of night, I invite you to stay connected with us at Buddhism for Sleep. Here we share timeless stories and teachings that soothe the mind, ease the heart, and guide you toward rest. Every tale is an offering of calmness, a gentle reminder of truths that bring light into the quiet moments before sleep. If you have not already, please subscribe to Buddhism for Sleep so that each night you can return to these teachings. Let them accompany you into dreams. Let them remind you that you are not alone on this path, that wisdom, compassion, and peace are always near, carried in the stories whispered across Generations like the simple words etched on a silver ring, this too shall pass, and in remembering that you will find the strength to let go, the courage to be present, and the serenity to rest deeply tonight and every night to come.